Good afternoon, dear students. Today's lecture is devoted to the topic of diagnosis and problem solving in the classroom, which occupies an important place in modern pedagogical practice. The educational process is dynamic and multifaceted, and for this reason, THs regularly encounter situations that require not only observation, but also careful analysis and professionally grounded intervention. In contemporary education, it is not sufficient merely to identify that a difficulty exists. A teacher must also be able to determine its causes, interpret the situation accurately, and select an appropriate strategy for improvement. This is precisely where pedagogical diagnosis becomes essential. It serves as a foundation for informed decision making and for the effective management of classroom situations. During this lecture, we will consider the nature of pedagogical diagnosis, the methods used to identify problems in the learning process, and the stages involved in developing practical solutions within the classroom environment. Let us begin with the goal of today's lecture. The central purpose is to introduce students to methods for diagnosing pedagogical problems in the classroom. This involves understanding how educational difficulties may be detected, interpreted, and analyzed in a systematic way. In addition, the lecture aims to teach students how to identify issues in the learning process and develop effective strategies to address them. It is important to emphasize that classroom difficulties rarely disappear on their own. They require pedagogically sound responses based on evidence and reflection. Another important aim is to develop skills in using diagnostic tools for analyzing pedagogical situations. These skills are especially significant for future teachers, since professional pedagogical activity demands the ability to respond thoughtfully and flexibly to challenges that arise in real instructional settings. Thus, the lecture combines theoretical understanding with practical orientation, preparing students to approach pedagogical problems in an analytical and constructive manner. The objectives of the lecture clarify the specific directions of our work. First, we will examine the main methods for diagnosing pedagogical problems. These methods provide the teacher with different ways of collecting and interpreting information about classroom difficulties. Second, we will become familiar with various types of pedagogical situations that require diagnosis. Not every classroom difficulty has the same nature. Some are connected with academic performance, others with motivation, communication, or emotional factors. Third, we will consider how to develop strategies for solving identified problems. Diagnosis alone is not sufficient unless it leads to purposeful pedagogical action. Finally, we will discuss how to analyze the causes of pedagogical problems and adapt strategies to eliminate them. This objective is especially important because an effective teacher does not respond only to symptoms, but seeks to understand the underlying causes of educational difficulties. The lecture also incorporates practical work and group discussion, which allows students to connect theoretical principles with real or simulated classroom cases. At this point, it is necessary to introduce the concept of pedagogical problem diagnosis. Pedagogical diagnosis may be defined as the process of identifying and analyzing problems that arise in the educational process in order to make informed decisions. This definition highlights two essential features. First, diagnosis is analytical in nature. And second, its purpose is not merely description, but pedagogical decision making. Through diagnosis, the teacher is able to understand what prevents students from achieving the intended educational outcomes. Such obstacles may relate to learning difficulties, insufficient motivation, ineffective teaching approaches, communication barriers, or broader contextual factors. Therefore, pedagogical diagnosis should be viewed as an indispensable component of reflective teaching practice. It enables the educator to move from general impressions to reasoned conclusions and from spontaneous reactions to methodologically presents a more detailed definition of pedagogical diagnosis. It is described as a systematic process of observing, analyzing, and interpreting students' behavior, learning activity, emotional state, and other aspects of the learning process. Particular attention should be paid to the word systematic. Diagnosis is not a random or intuitive act. Rather, it is a structured professional activity that requires attentiveness, consistency, and interpretive competence. The teacher observes not only what students know, but also how they behave, how they participate, how they respond emotionally to tasks, and how they interact with the instructional environment. Such an approach allows the educator to obtain a fuller picture of the educational situation. This is especially important because classroom problems are rarely one dimensional. In many cases, academic difficulties are connected with emotional, motivational, or interpersonal factors. Thus, pedagogical diagnosis is best understood as a multidimensional analytical process aimed at understanding the real condition of teaching and learning. The key purpose of pedagogical diagnosis is to identify problems at an early stage and to develop strategies for addressing them, thereby making timely adjustments to teaching methods possible. This early detection function is of great pedagogical significance. If difficulties are recognized only after they become deeply rooted, the process of correction becomes more complex and less effective. By contrast, timely diagnosis enables the teacher to intervene before minor obstacles develop into serious barriers to learning. Equally important is the strategic dimension of diagnosis. It does not end with identifying that a problem exists. Rather, it creates the basis for determining what should be changed, improved, or adapted in the educational process. Consequently, pedagogical diagnosis acts as a bridge between analysis and action. It supports a proactive rather than reactive model of teaching practice. Diagnosis is important because it enables the teacher to determine which aspects of the educational process require improvement. In other words, it helps to make teaching more deliberate, evidence-based, and responsive to students' actual needs. One of its most significant contributions is that it supports the personalization of learning. When a teacher understands the specific characteristics, difficulties, and needs of learners, it becomes possible to adapt teaching methods, instructional materials, and interaction styles more effectively. This is particularly relevant in contemporary education, where student diversity is increasingly recognized as a central pedagogical reality. Learners differ in pace, motivation, readiness, background knowledge, and emotional disposition. Diagnosis allows these differences to be taken into account in a meaningful and professionally responsible way. Therefore, pedagogical diagnosis matters not only because it reveals problems, but because it contributes to a more individualized and pedagogically appropriate learning environment. The example on this slide illustrates a familiar classroom situation. A teacher observes that a group of students is struggling with a task, despite the fact that the theoretical material has been explained thoroughly. At first glance, this may appear to be a simple issue of weak academic performance. However, from a diagnostic perspective, the situation requires deeper analysis. The difficulty may stem from a lack of motivation, insufficient understanding of foundational concepts, low confidence, or even emotional tension. Thus, diagnosis is necessary to distinguish between surface manifestations and underlying causes. This example demonstrates an important pedagogical principle. When students do not achieve expected results, the teacher should not immediately assume unwillingness or inability. Instead, the situation should be examined carefully through diagnostic methods that reveal the real nature of the problem. In this sense, diagnosis enables the teacher to respond not superficially, but professionally and constructively. Pedagogical problems may be diagnosed through a range of methods, including quantitative and qualitative approaches, as well as observational and testing procedures. The principal methods are observation, testing, surveys and questionnaires, and conversations with students. Each provides a distinct type of information and serves a specific diagnostic purpose. Observation helps examine behavior, interaction, and classroom engagement directly. Testing allows a more systematic assessment of knowledge and skill mastery. Surveys and questionnaires reveal students' perceptions, attitudes, and emotional states, while conversations help explore individual difficulties, misunderstandings, and interpersonal tensions in greater depth. At this stage, it is important to consider the principal diagnostic methods in greater detail. since each of them serves a specific function in pedagogical analysis. An effective teacher should use different methods depending on the nature of the educational problem. The first method is observation, which allows the teacher to directly examine students' behavior, their interaction with learning material, and their communication with one another. The second method is testing, through which students' knowledge and skills can be assessed in a structured and measurable way. The third method is surveys and questionnaires, which help collect information about students' perceptions of lessons, their attitudes toward learning, and their emotional states. The fourth method is conversations with students, conducted to identify individual difficulties or conflicts that may hinder successful learning. Thus, the use of several diagnostic methods provides a more comprehensive understanding of the educational situation and supports more effective pedagogical decision-making. Here, the focus shifts from diagnosis itself to the process of solving pedagogical problems. Once a difficulty has been identified, it is not enough merely to describe it. The teacher must also determine how it can be resolved in a purposeful and effective way. This process includes several stages. The first is identifying the problem, that is, defining the core difficulty. The second is identifying the causes, since effective intervention depends on understanding the factors that produce the problem. The third stage is developing a strategy, which involves selecting appropriate pedagogical measures. The final stage is implementing solutions and evaluating their practical effectiveness. Thus, problem solving in education should be regarded as a structured and reflective process based on careful analysis and informed pedagogical action. This slide outlines the sequence through which a pedagogical difficulty is examined and addressed. The process begins with identifying the problem, that is, determining what creates the obstacle in the educational process, whether it is low motivation, weak engagement, difficulties in interaction, or personal factors affecting learners. The next step is identifying the causes, with attention given to the conditions that may have produced the difficulty, such as inappropriate instructional methods, insufficient organization, or classroom context. After that, the teacher moves to developing a strategy by selecting suitable measures, and finally to implementing solutions. That is, applying those measures and observing their effectiveness in practice. Taken together, these stages show that pedagogical decision-making requires reflection, consistency, and a well-structured course of action. At this point, the discussion moves from theory to practice. The task is designed to develop students' ability to apply diagnostic methods in the analysis of concrete pedagogical situations. Each group is asked to examine a specific case, identify the source of the difficulty, and propose a reasoned way of addressing it. In the first case, the issue concerns incomplete homework. In the second, conflict between two students. Both situations require thoughtful analysis rather than a superficial reaction. Particular importance should be given to the final question, since any pedagogical solution can only be effective when it takes into account the specific context of the class. As we come to the end of the lecture, several essential points should be emphasized. Pedagogical diagnosis is not a secondary element of teaching practice. It is one of the principal means by which classroom difficulties can be recognized and addressed in due time. Particular significance also belongs to the sequence of pedagogical response, identifying the problem, examining its causes, selecting an appropriate strategy, and putting that strategy into practice. Equally important is the use of different diagnostic methods, including observation, testing, surveys, and conversation, since each of them reveals a different aspect of the educational situation. Ultimately, effective teaching requires flexibility. A competent teacher must be able to adapt both diagnostic procedures and problem-solving approaches to the specific context in which the difficulty arises. In conclusion, effective work with classroom difficulties demands both methodological variety and professional judgment. A teacher must be able not only to recognize a problem, but also to respond to it thoughtfully in ways that support a productive learning environment and promote student success. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has contributed to a clearer understanding of pedagogical diagnosis and its role in addressing classroom difficulties.